Willard Van Orman Quine is, in addition to being one of the most eminent logicians of the 20th century, I would argue the most profound and important philosopher of our time. Trained during the heyday of logical positivism in its most powerful techniques and analytic tools, Quine has done more than any other thinker to undermine that tradition. And there's no small bit of irony to that. He was trained at Harvard under the tutelage of perhaps the greatest of the positivists, Rudolf Carnap. And it is Quine's distinction to have moved a large way towards undermining the logical foundations of logical positivism. In the background of Quine's work and his historical moment, as it were, his context, were a series of setbacks to the positivist attempt to reduce mathematics to logic, which I had mentioned previously in connection with A.J. Ayer. The two most important such setbacks were the continuing anomaly of Russell's paradox. Russell constructed a paradox of set theory such that he was able to construct a set which included all and only those sets and elements which are not self-members. And then the paradox is that set itself a self-member? And it's paradoxical. It can't be answered either way. And while there are various strategies for dealing with that paradox, it remains a paradox. The other, perhaps more profound setback to the project was Gödel's famous incompleteness proof. What Gödel was able to do was a artificial language called piano arithmetic was used to formulate elementary number theory. And what Gödel did was, through a couple transformations, one called the arithmetization of metamathematics, was able to construct, and through something else called Gödel numbering, which is a way of coding an expression into another expression. It's used in all sorts of military codes, was able to construct a self-referential proposition, which said, I am not provable. Now remember what completeness and consistency means. If that sentence is true, then it is not provable, and therefore you have a true sentence in the language of piano arithmetic and elementary number theory, which is not provable. If, on the other hand, it is not true, right, then it is not the case that it's not provable and it is provable. Then there is a provable statement in piano arithmetic and elementary number theory which is not provable, and that violates the strictures of completeness and consistency, which insists that a complete or consistent theory must be able to prove everything true in it, and everything true in it ought be provable. And in fact, it's not simply a theorem, but a proof. He proves that no matter how many extra moves you make, no matter how many extra axioms you posit, you can never have consistency or completeness for elementary number theory. And what we learn from that is that mathematics is not purely reducible to logic. You have to supplement it with extra assumptions, perhaps assumptions from set theory. Okay, so much for context. Now let us look at what Quine was attacking. He directed his criticism at the foundational, or what I would call the Kantian elements of logical positivism. Positivistic linguistic analysis and epistemology tried to constitute itself as a first philosophy that foundationally and unequivocally established the meaning of expressions or discourse prior to scientific analysis of truth or verifiability. Thus, in a sense, what the positivists tried to do, and I tried to represent that in that graphic I gave you on air, was to suggest what could and couldn't be said. What was the range of legitimate, meaningful discourse? And there's a very strong correlation between this and what Kant did. Kant, as you remember, had, through the analysis of the a priori categories of mind, attempted to delimit what could possibly be said meaningfully and what could not. Well, what the logical positivists did is take those conceptual schemes and stick them into language. And say, through an analysis of language, I can tell you before you do any scientific work what you can say and what you can't say, what moves are legitimate and what are not legitimate. And obviously what we have is, as Kant had presupposed, a certain set, rigorous, fixed a priori categories of mind. Similarly, we find that the positivists had a similar conception of language. We might call it the analytic conception of language, whereby any language or a theory possesses a determinate meaning or contains fixed structural elements or features. Right? So it's a very fixed and final structure. Well, Quine's first large-scale attack on this tradition came in a path-breaking article entitled Two Dogmas of Empiricism in this text from a logical point of view. Now, the first dogma is the belief that there is a basic and fundamental distinction between what Ayer called analytic and synthetic truths. The second dogma is what Ayer called reductionism, or the belief that every meaningful statement about the world is equivalent to some statement that is a logical construct of terms referring to sense experience or sense datum. Okay, so let's turn to the first dogma, the dogma of analyticity. According to the first dogma, an analytic sentence is true solely on the basis of its meanings, rather than any factual states of the world. We have to pause here, because Quine points something out. This is a funny notion of meaning. It's clearly what we might call intentional. It refers to something going on between our ears in a certain sort of sense. It's not to be confused with a very clear-cut notion, reference, which is extensional. Right? So if you ask me the extensional meaning or reference of the term human, it simply refers to all of the set of entities which we would call human. But the intentional meaning is some sort of bizarre thing that goes on between our ears. I want to pause because Quine, actually in his own text, pauses very briefly. What he does is says, okay, I'm going to play your intentional meaning game out. But before we go any farther, let's realize how, if you're critiquing metaphysics, this is the most metaphysical notion possible. I mean, ask yourself, how much does a meaning weigh? Right? Is one meaning heavier than another? Is one meaning larger than another? Where exactly are meanings lodged? What kind of funny entities are these things, these intentional meanings? And Quine gives us a wonderful little quip. The forerunner to intentional meaning is Aristotelian essence. Right? The essence of man is a rational animal. Well, once philosophy turns linguistic, we just take that essence and say, well, that's the meaning of the term man, rational animal. And he says that's just a linguistic turn of metaphysics. But let's pause it. Let's give the positivists their meaning and see if we can't refute them nonetheless. According to the positivists, our analytic truths are based solely on meaning. We can distinguish that into two different classes. And I've tried to express that on that little sheet of sentences I've given you. You'll see sentence 1 says, no unmarried man is married. That is literally a logical truth or tautology. Right? You can replace anything in its place. Now, the point is such tautologies actually are extremely uncontroversial and extremely uninteresting. The second class of analytic sentences are far more interesting. And that's number 2, no bachelor is married. Now, the point Quine makes is you can turn 2 into 1, a logical truth, by substituting synonyms. Right? Bachelor means the same intentionally as unmarried man, so you stick unmarried man in for bachelor, and you get yourself a logical truth. So thus, the second and critically important class of analytic truths rests on the notion of synonymy, or sameness of intentional meaning. Now, there's a problem here, that such terms as bachelor and unmarried man, right, two distinct expressions, are synonymous, can't be claimed by definition. Because to do that is to put the cart before the horse. The lexicographic work of someone writing a dictionary presupposes the notion of synonymy, which is in fact recursively drawn then from linguistic behavior, actual usage. Right? So to say by definition an unmarried man is a bachelor begs the question, how do we know in fact that they're synonymous? And in fact, aside from very explicit use of definitions, such that you introduce a new notation and say, insofar as in my works this notation occurs, it will mean this. Aside from that, definition doesn't get you anywhere in terms of understanding synonymy or meaning, because definitions rest on the prior notion of synonymy. Well, the positivists might go for another move. They might say, well, synonymy really rests on interchangeability of expressions, saving the truth. If any time I come across the term bachelor, I can put in the expression unmarried man and save the truth, therefore they're interchangeable and hence synonymous. Now, there's a problem with that doctrine as well. If you have that sheet of sentences, you'll see Quine on interchangeability. And it basically takes the form, every X is a Y, right? Every bachelor is an unmarried man. The problem is it doesn't distinguish between intentional meaning and extensional meaning or reference. So if you look at sentence 4, that says every bachelor is an unmarried man, and that's presumably interchangeable, those two terms. But similarly, look at 5. Every creature with a heart is a creature with kidneys. Right? Literally just as true, because every single creature with a heart does have kidneys. Kidneys purify the blood. But that's somehow not thought to be based on meanings. That's based on facts. Another example would be, we all know that based on meanings, man is a rational animal. But it's only based on fact that man is a featherless biped. Right? And Quine says that's rather funny how you're able to distinguish. Clearly, interchangeability can't distinguish between those two senses of synonymy. And what we basically find out from this is synonymy is a dead end. We're not going to get to the notion of analyticity through an analysis of synonymy, right? Because it doesn't distinguish between extensional and intentional meaning. Right, let's make another move. Analyticity is presumably a relation between sentences and a language or theory. Okay? So we say then that sentence S is analytic for L under certain conditions, perhaps. And Carnap, Rudolf Carnap, one of Quine's mentors, posited just such conditions. He called them semantic rules. These semantic rules, especially in the paradigm case of artificial languages, specify by one means or another, either a recursive logical proof or some other system, all the sentences which are analytic in L, the language L or theory L. Now, the problem with this explanation of analyticity is that the word analytic appears in the definition, i.e. the semantic rule. Semantic defines analytic for L. Now you can eliminate the word analytic and simply say that semantic rules specify a certain set of truths in L, but then you simply replace the unexplained word analytic with the unexplained phrase semantic rule. And in fact, Quine says, how will we know what's a semantic rule in the language L and what's just another proposition in the language L? He says it's real simple. So I have a sheet. Let's say semantic rules, 1, 2, 3. And that's the only way you'll know, because they're indistinguishable in form from any of the other sentences of that language. So such rules delimiting statements in L as analytic rest on the prior notion of analyticity and can't explain it. Okay. Quine says that analyticity is based on the presupposition that there are some statements of our language which are true and have no factual basis. And he says, while it seems intuitively reasonable, no hard distinction can be drawn demarcating such sentences from their synthetic counterparts. And in fact, he suggests we might try this move, we might try that move, this philosopher's tried another move, and he concludes and says, better still, we might just stop tugging at our bootstraps altogether. Right? There is no way of squaring this circle. In fact, that such a distinction exists is a dogma or metaphysical article of faith. Right? Analytic and synthetic distinction cannot be hardly, finally, and fixedly drawn. Now, the second dogma of empiricism, reductionism, is strongly related to the first, and in fact supports it. Thus, if you'll remember the verification theory of meaning, which presupposes reductionism, claim that statements or expressions are synonymous when they share the same method of empirical confirmation. Right? So we finally got a handle on synonymy here. It hangs on empirical confirmation. Thus, the relation between a statement and experiences which constitute empirical confirmation is, for Ayer, said to be one of radical reductionism. And such reductionism, as we'll remember, claims that every meaningful expression can be translated into sentences about sense experience. Quine points out, philosophers in the empirical tradition have been trying this game for a long, long time. Remember, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume all tried to do this with individual terms. Each word should refer to an idea which could then be turned into a statement about sense contents. And as we'll remember, they failed. Didn't work. The logical positivists realized that the problem was you can't do it on a term-by-term basis. Let's try it on a sentence-by-sentence basis. That's why they were so hung up about propositions. Carnap, for example, Quine thinks had the most fruitful approach. Try to characterize or define physical objects in terms of a string of conjoined sentences of the form quality Q is at point instant X, Y, Z, and T, right? You put it in a four-dimensional space-time grid and say greenness at whatever our temporal location is right now, and we'll put a time constant on. And if we put enough of those together, we can actually describe, say, this podium or my tie or something of that nature. But Quine quite urbanely points out, you know, the locution is at in that sentence remains undefined, and so the whole project fails. In other words, you can specify the quality as referring to a sense datum, and you can even give me the X, Y, Z, and T, but what do you mean by is at? How do you define that in sense content terms? Well, you can't, right? It won't go all the way down into sense contents. The dogma persists in the belief that for any synthetic statement, there exists a unique range of sensory experiences that would confirm or disconfirm that sentence. We found that with air, didn't we? Well, this implies that each such sentence stands before the tribunal of truth and experience on its own. Quine insists on linguistic holism and conceptual holism. Our sentences face experience as a whole or one body. And in fact, we can think of them as constituting a web of belief. In fact, if we want to, we can hold any of our sentences as analytic, as a logical truth, simply by redistributing the values along the web, as it were. Right? So we could say, in fact, all humans are 5'6" is an analytic truth simply by redefining at other places what we mean by 5'6" in human. Anything can be held analytic in that web by simply reweaving it. And Quine offers the following image to think of our language and our culture. Total science, or the sum of our knowledge, Quine likens to a field of force. The boundary conditions of this field of force are experience. Anomalous experiences at the periphery, the boundary conditions, induced readjustments of the sentences in the field's interior. And the total field is sufficiently underdetermined by the periphery such that any recalcitrant experience leaves much choice as to which sentences or beliefs to reevaluate. And an example that Quine draws on is even logical truths are subject to revision. He notes that there was a point in the history of science, in the wave-particle struggle over light, interpretation of light, where some scientists said, look, you know what we really have to do? Let's just jettison the law of excluded middle, P or not P. That you have to have one or the other. And Quine says, well, it actually worked out. Quantum mechanics sort of saved us from having to do that, but if it hadn't, that would have been a logical thing to do. That would have made perfect sense. Every belief in that field of force, no matter how far we push it into the center, can be rewoven, and there's more than one choice as to what to reweave. So our logical laws, then, even the formal laws that Quine did so much to postulate and to clarify, are simply sentences we place at the center of the field. And they are behavioralistically those we are least likely, or even, in fact, desirous to change. So unless we're absolutely forced to, we will keep the law of excluded middle, but it is not beyond the possibility that we'll drop it. No sentence is immune to revision. And while the periphery of our field must be kept squared with experience, the chief considerations governing the arrangement of the interior are conservation of belief and simplicity, especially of laws. And we'll come to see that these are not, quote, foundational epistemological principles, but rather they're evolutionary. We have a limited amount of storage space in our disks, as it were. Conservation of belief means that as we reweave our beliefs, as we change our sentences, it's easier to detect where we made mistakes. Similarly with simplicities, the less moving parts we have in a theoretical explanation, the easier it is when we screw up to figure out where it is we screwed up, where it is we made our mistake. This is significant because whereas the positivists allowed pragmatic considerations to rule over only our choice of synthetic beliefs, Quine, by destroying the analytic-synthetic distinction, demands a more thoroughgoing pragmatism. And I'd like to very briefly quote this statement on this. Carnap, Lewis, and others take a pragmatic stand on the question of choosing between language forms, scientific frameworks. But their pragmatism leaves off at the imagined boundary between the analytic and the synthetic. In repudiating such a boundary, I espouse a more thorough pragmatism. Each man is given a scientific heritage, plus a continuing barrage of sensory stimulation. And the considerations which guide him in warping his scientific heritage to fit his continuing sensory promptings are, where rational, pragmatic. Foundationalism has gone out the window. There is no first philosophy. Okay. That was really, strangely enough, a warm-up for his most powerful assault on the logical positivists and what I consider his masterwork, Ontological Relativity and Other Essays. Quine's thesis is that when we specify the entities in some theory or language, we'll call that the object language. We do so by translating sentences with those entities into another background language or theory, which we'll call the meta-language, which is richer and more inclusive. I'll give you a straightforward example. If you're learning French and someone says a sentence in French, and you say, what in heaven's name do those terms refer to? Right? The answer they give you, if you don't speak French, will be in a background language which you know, preferably English. And I've even given you a very little artificial example here on ontological relativity. I've written number 6, a proposition in formal logic. Don't worry about reading it. Don't try to figure it out. Don't even bother reading 7, which is a recursive definition of each of the terms in it. The point is, if you were to understand that sentence, you would do it in this way. It would be translated into a language you do know. And as a result, I've given you the punchline in 8. The sentence turns out to translate meaning the ontological reference of some object language is relative to the meta-language it's translated into. And this is a perfect exemplification of it. Now, in artificial and recondite languages, such translation literally reduces entities to others and thus eliminates them from view. So a set theoretic interpretation of number theory does away with numbers in favor of sets or classes. Now, Quine does much of this establishment of this problem of translation in terms of set theory and mathematics. I'm not going to bore you with that. I'm going to give you some common sense examples. But first I want to tell you what is the thesis, that there's a twofold ontological relativity that comes out of this. The first is that the reference or ontological import of an object language, right, of a set of sentences we don't understand, of a theory in science that we don't know, is relative to the meta-language it's translated into. The entities in that meta-language will be used to map the language of the object language of the scientific theory. In our case, our meta-language of last resort is our home language, vernacular English. So the fundamental entities of an object language will depend on the meta-language you translate into and the perspective we take into it. If we choose to take an epistemological, phenomenological take on it, a physicalist take on it, or any other sort of take. So the meta-language serves as a sort of conceptual coordinate grid, right, for interpreting that object language. Now, I want to give you a sort of intuitive example, the case of what Quine calls radical translation. He wants to show that such translation is relative and therefore indeterminate. Consider, we have a character who is a field linguist, a masterful field linguist, and he has come across the find of a lifetime. There's this island that's unmapped, no one's ever seen it before, with a people on it that no one has ever met before, with a language which is unrelated to any other language. And this guy's licking his chops. He sees tenure all over the place if he can map this language. So he goes in. The problem is, how does he break into the language? Well, it will start with observation sentences, right? The sort of sentences that we'll all agree to in a certain prompting. I'm walking across this lectern now. Anyone in this room will agree to that sentence, right? It's an observation sentence. So our field linguist is sitting with his natives, trying to break into the language, and he sees a rabbit run by. And his native friends turn to him and say, "Gavaji, Gavaji, Gavaji." And he goes, "Wow, okay, I got it. I got my first term in the language. Gavaji means rabbit." There's a problem there. Our linguist is an expert. He's a very cagey guy. And he says, well, you know what? How do I know that that doesn't mean, in fact, there it goes? In fact, Quine mentions an animal I think he calls the indri, which is a lemur of Madagascar, which literally means there it goes, right? The field linguist who went to that island thought they were referring to the name of the animal when they were just saying there it goes. So he waits for a deer to run by and says, Gavaji, and the native looks at him like, what, are you from Planet Claire or something? This is okay. Gavaji is rabbit. But is it necessarily? Suppose they have a different ontology than ours. And I've tried to suggest this with those sentences Quine on radical translation. We think of objects as the basic entities, right? Physical stuff, bodies. But maybe they don't. Maybe they are more concerned with smaller bits of animals. So when they say Gavaji, they mean there goes an undetached rabbit part. Right? There's a rabbit ear that hasn't been cut off. There it is. Okay. Suppose there's another possibility. Suppose in distinction to our own object-oriented language, that their first great scientist was a Heraclitean and told them it's all flux, it's all process, it's all time slices. So when they say Gavaji, they don't mean rabbit. They don't have any rabbits. They say it's rabbiting over there. There's a spatiotemporal rabbit slice. Right? Lo, it rabbiteth, or something of that nature. How do you decide which it is? Well, there is a trick. You have to figure out what he calls the referential apparatus of the language. What we would call logical particles. And it's pretty straightforward. Terms like plural endings, singular endings, a, every, and, not. Right? Those sorts of terms. Once you have that, you can pull out that rabbit and point to one ear and say, Gavaji? Point to the next ear. Gavaji? If he goes no, then you know, or if you say better yet, same Gavaji to the two ears. And if he says no, then you know it's undetached rabbit part, right? Because they're different parts. But if he says yes, then you know Gavaji is not undetached rabbit parts and is one of the other two possibilities. So we can try to eliminate the possibility of Gavaji being spatiotemporal rabbit slices by saying, holding up our rabbit, Gavaji? He says, yep. Put it down underneath the table so that he knows you're putting it down underneath the table. Pull it back up. Same Gavaji. And if he says, yes, you know it's not spatiotemporal rabbit slices because this is a different spatiotemporal rabbit slice. It occurred 15 seconds later or something like that. And that way you can decide. Solve the problem of radical translation. Except, how do you know you translated the referential apparatus correctly? Right? Suppose you assume that Gavaji means rabbit, and you reread then all of his statements of and, every, some, and whatnot, such that it makes it seem like it's a rabbit. In fact, it's extremely possible to do that. You can get all of the referential apparatus wrong just so that they turn out to be physical objects. So then how does our cagey linguist solve this problem? And Quine answers, a cagey linguist is a caged linguist. You're not trying to get into that native's head. All you want is when you order a plate of Gavaji, you get it. So any way you translate, it's fine, as long as you can get around in their native language, as long as you can play their language game, as Wittgenstein would put it. Right? And there may be more than one way to do it. And he says, actually, what you'll probably do is, no matter whether they think it's time slices or whether they think it's undetached parts, you're going to read it in your ontology. That's the ontological relativity. You're always going to assume they're talking about what you're talking about. And if it becomes impossible to do that, then maybe you'll be forced to move to another posit. But otherwise, you're just going to go for simplicity. Because it's simpler that way. It's easier to calculate. Now, that's radical translation. But we can think of contexts where that occurs in regular translation. Right? I'm going to give you a weak one and then a strong one. The weak one probably be common to you all, or at least those of you who know French. You know the convention ne rien, which means nothing, right? Well, it's an interesting locution because it's actually a one-word phrase which is separated by other words, by a verb, right? Which is very strange. Suppose instead of saying that was a one-word locution separated by other words, that it's in fact two words. Rien means anything and ne means not. You could translate it that way. Then ne pas would mean not and pas mean plus, negative and a positive being a negative, and you could do that up and down the line. Why not? Well, Quine says, why not? It's because the first guy who did it didn't do it that way. It's just as simple to treat it as a one-word locution, so we do. But if you want to do it the other way, knock yourself out. If you can get your way from Paris to Chartres whenever you want, asking directions with ne rien, ne pas with your translation, that's just as good. There's no reason to think that there is one right translation or one right interpretation of that language. You're not trying to get into people's heads. You don't want intentional meanings. You just want to be able to get your way from Paris to Chartres when you want, or similarly, to get a good plate of kavaji when you're hungry. The stronger example is in Japanese. He says, whereas we'll say 5 cattle, the Japanese actually have a term which comes right between the word 5 and the word about cattle, which says, basically, you can interpret it one of 2 ways. Either it modifies the word 5, such that 5 is now going to be used to count animals, or it modifies the word cattle in such a way that it's now going to be quantified cattle, like we have with the word herd. And he says, well, which is the right translation? And if you have any propensity to figure out the right translation, you've missed the point. There is no right translation. If either of them gets you, a good plate of beef in or can buy you 5 cattle in a market in Japan, it works. That's the only test of translation. Does it function? Does it get us through the language? All right. So then in translating a language, in every case, what we're going to do is posit something we'll call analytic hypotheses. Those analytic hypotheses tell us the first rough guesses as to how to do that referential apparatus, how to individuate terms. Therefore, all translations hinge on the choice of analytic hypotheses, because it is likely that we can come up with more than one set of analytic hypotheses for translating one language into another. And as I've mentioned, the key there is the rendering of the logical particles. So such analytic hypotheses, I hope you realize now, are in fact underdetermined by the facts of linguistic behavior. And thus distinct analytic hypotheses can produce contradictory but equally effective manuals of translation. Therefore, the implication is the ontology of a language is also relative not only to the meta-language you translate into, but also to the analytic hypotheses you use to translate that language into, or into that meta-language. So you in fact have double relativity. Thus, what counts in any given object language as a logical as opposed to a factual truth will vary with the meta-language as well as with the analytic hypotheses. Another reason why you cannot have a meaningful distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. And the result, of course, is that that distinction is completely undermined, as is the distinction between metaphysics and science, right? Because all of a sudden you can't use the analytic-synthetic distinction to say what's meaningful and what's not. If you know how to use the words in a sentence, they're meaningful. And if they prompt a response, they're meaningful. Okay? Because meaning does not refer to something that goes on between our ears. It refers to a move in a language game. If you can prompt a response from someone, that's all there is to it. There's nothing going on in our ears that have to do with language. Language has to do with things outside of us that we use to communicate to one another. Intersubjectivity. Okay, now, I kept talking about language games because I want to suggest the affinity between this and the latter Wittgenstein's work. But here's the big difference. The latter Wittgenstein also acknowledged that there was indeterminacy of translation. Right, that there was a certain amount of ontological relativity, especially from artificial and recondite languages. But he thought that our use of our home language, right, of our vernacular, revealed our pre-systematic ontological awareness. That before we theorized, we really knew what all of the entities of our common sense home language are all about. Quine's thesis, however, argues that reference in our own home language can go inscrutable. Which is to say, suppose I was to stand up and confess and say, look, all my life, I never really believed in physical objects. It's been spatio-temporal time slices for me all the way down. My father brought me up to be a Heraclitean. The first thought you would have is, how curious and perverse. But the second thought you would have is, who cares? You still get in the same car and drive home. You still call the same things I call a chair, a chair. We still communicate perfectly effectively. How do I know that all of you don't have spatio-temporal time slice ontologies? Doesn't make any difference. There's no way of knowing, and who would care? As long as we can communicate effectively in our home language, that's all we ask of it. That is to say, in a more technical way of looking at it, there is no richer meta language to translate into. There's no larger conceptual grid that we can translate or map the sentences of our home language onto. So literally, questions about the reference of our home language are meaningless. They're absurd. It's like asking me, well, what is your absolute position in space right now? And as you walk across this podium, what is your absolute velocity? That's an absurd question. There's only relative velocities and relative positions. Similarly with mapping the ontology of our home language. All of our ontologies in every language is relative to another language we map into and the analytic hypotheses. And when you get to your home language, you've gone about as far as you can go. And you just stop there. And you don't stop because, deep down I have an intuition about what it all means. You stop because there's nowhere else to go. And if your home language gets you cheeseburgers when you want it, gets you gavaji when you need it, gets you from Paris to Chartres, you're more than satisfied with it. That's all it is. It's not a mirror of the world. It's a causal connection between you and your environment. That's what your language is. It's a tool, right? It's an empirical phenomenon. Now, the result of these doctrines is that philosophy, as a foundational analysis of linguistic meanings prior to scientific study, is rendered not only impossible, but laughable. Right? And in that sense, he does agree with Wittgenstein. There's a lot of similarity there. In fact, as with Wittgenstein, it's not clear that there's anything left to call philosophy, which is distinguishable from science. Right? Presumably, they're both talking about the world, and science is just common sense made self-reflective. So Quine urges that we take into consideration his next project, what he calls epistemology naturalized. No longer thinking of the question of knowledge as theoretical, as demanding a foundational answer, but rather it's the empirical study of how a particular species, Homo sapiens, uses its symbolic systems, the sounds it makes, the scribblings it marks onto paper, to erect scientific theories and explanations. Right? And it presumably would be an evolutionary theory as well. Not only how it's done within each child, vis-a-vis behavioral and cognitive psychology, but how the species did it over time. That would obviously include experimental psychology, as well as the sociology of science and knowledge we find in Quine, among others. In addition, it would have to account for itself. How epistemology naturalized itself came to arise as a phenomena among this particular species. And presumably would search for causal connections between language, which is not something outside of the world, but is part of the world, is an empirical phenomena subject to scientific empirical analysis. And it would suggest that what we need to find is the causal connection between that part of the world and the other parts of the world, between the linguistic and the non-linguistic, not foundationally, but empirically, provisionally, scientifically. And it is with that thought, that project for Quine, that I wish to leave you.